Get out before your daughter sees you crying on the floor of my hotel. That was the sentence that opened the worst year of Elena Vaughn's life, and she would replay it in her head 1,000
Where is
times
he?
before she understood it was also the sentence that
I'm not
saved
supposed to
it.
say.
A hotel general manager had said it to her 11 months after the crash. In the lobby of a property Elena's own investment fund quietly held a minority stake in, after a front desk clerk mishandled Maddie's wheelchair transfer badly enough that Elena had sat down on the marble floor of the lobby and simply broken, for exactly 90 seconds, in front of a Tuesday afternoon full of strangers, before pulling herself back up and finishing the check-in as though nothing had happened at all. She never told the manager who she was. She let the humiliation sit exactly where it landed, because there was something almost clarifying about being spoken to, for once, as nobody at all. She was 34 years old, and by every metric the business press liked to print, she had already lived 3 careers worth of success. She had built Vaughn Meridian from a 9-person freight routing startup into a logistics and infrastructure company valued past $4 billion, and she had done it in 11 years, most of them spent sleeping 4 hours a night, and telling herself that rest was a reward she would collect later, once the company was safe, once the next round closed, once the next crisis passed. There was always a next crisis. She had built her whole adult identity around being the person who solved them. None of that mattered on the night the drunk driver ran the red light on Colfax Avenue in Denver, doing 61 miles an hour, into the passenger side of her car, where her 8-year-old daughter Maddie sat in the booster seat she had almost outgrown, arguing about whether the moon followed the car or just seemed to. Elena walked away with a fractured wrist and a scar along her collarbone that had faded to something you had to know to look for. Maddie did not walk away from anything again. The spinal injury was incomplete, the surgeon said, using the word incomplete the way people use the word fine when they mean something else entirely. Incomplete meant there was a chance. Incomplete meant nothing in practice for the first 14 months. No matter how many specialists Elena flew in, no matter how many consultation rooms she sat in while men and women with excellent credentials told her, gently, that she should begin adjusting her expectations. Elena Vaughn did not adjust her expectations. She hired the next specialist. By the time she brought Maddie to the Ridgeline Rehabilitation Center outside Denver, they had been through 4 major hospital programs and 91 weeks of therapy that had produced, by the most generous accounting, small mercies rather than progress. Maddie could sit upright, unassisted. She could transfer from bed to chair with help. Below the waist, her legs did what they were told by gravity and nothing else. Ridgeline was smaller than the university programs, calmer, built around a philosophy the director called low-intensity, high-frequency stimulus rather than the brute force protocols Maddie had cycled through before. Elena wasn't hopeful. She had stopped being hopeful somewhere around month 16. She was, however, still willing to try, and she had come to understand that willingness, not hope, was the fuel that actually got you through a day like this. They had been at Ridgeline 6 weeks when Maddie first noticed the man in the maintenance uniform. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Elena had stepped into the hallway to take a call from her CFO about a shareholder letter that could not wait, holding up one finger to Maddie. 5 minutes, and Maddie had wheeled herself near the big window at the end of the corridor to wait. Through a half-open therapy room door across the hall, she watched a man kneeling beside a boy of about 9 who was gripping a set of parallel bars like they were the only solid thing left in the world. Left leg first, the man said. Don't think about it. Thinking makes it worse. Just move. He was maybe 40, built like someone who had spent a long time doing something physically demanding for a living, gray threading through dark hair cut close to his scalp. He wore the same navy polo every maintenance worker at Ridgeline wore, a small embroidered logo over the heart, and he was watching the boy with a stillness that had nothing performative in it. Maddie had been through enough physical therapy to know what real attention looked like versus what marking time looked like. This was real attention, and it was coming from a man whose badge said facilities. She watched for 11 minutes. She did not say anything, because she had not said very much of anything to anyone outside her mother and 2 therapists in the 14 months since the crash, not out of inability, the doctors were careful to clarify, but out of a kind of grief-locked silence that had its own clinical name and its own uncertain timeline for resolving. She simply watched, and when Elena came back around the corner apologizing for the delay, Maddie was sitting straighter than she had in weeks, looking at an empty doorway with an expression her mother had not seen on her face in a long time. Curiosity, Elena asked at the front desk the next morning. The man's name, the receptionist said, mildly puzzled that the CEO of Von Meridian was asking about a member of the janitorial staff, was Jonah Reed. He had been with the facility 8 months, facilities and equipment maintenance, occasional informal assistance during therapy sessions when extra hands were short, not officially trained. Very good with the kids, though. Some of the therapists let him sit in. Elena thought about that answer for most of a board call she barely listened to. She thought about the expression on her daughter's face. That afternoon, she found Jonah Reed in the equipment room and introduced herself, and he said without any particular ceremony that he knew who she was and that he had noticed Maddie noticing him. "I'm not asking you to be her therapist," Elena said. "I'm asking you to spend 15 minutes with her doing whatever it is you were doing yesterday and tell me honestly what you see." He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that told her he was actually weighing the request rather than performing consideration. "I can't promise you anything," he said finally. "Good," she said. "The people who promise me things are usually the ones who don't deliver." Something close to a smile crossed his face. 4 o'clock, he said. "East Therapy Room. I won't push her." "I know," Elena said, and somehow she believed it before she had any reason to. The session lasted 20 minutes. Jonah sat on a low foam roller, so he was at Maddie's eye level, and asked her one question, whether there was any place on her legs she could still feel temperature, warm or cool, anywhere at all. Maddie considered him for a long time, and then raised her hand and touched the outside of her right knee. "Good," he said, without making a production of it. "That's something. You don't have to talk," he added, not looking up from the small rubber therapy ball he was turning over in his hands. "I've worked with people who couldn't talk, some of the toughest people I've ever known." He didn't tell her what he thought was possible. He didn't mention hope or belief or any of the words the specialists had used so often they'd started to sound like wallpaper. He simply picked up the foam roller, moved it 2 feet to the left, and told her they were going to try one very small thing and that she needed to put all her attention on that one spot on her knee and nowhere else. Not the rest of the leg. Just the spot. Elena watched from the hallway through the narrow door window, arms crossed so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, keeping the promise she'd made to herself not to interfere, though it cost her nearly everything she had. 22 minutes later, Jonah walked Maddie back to the door himself and told Elena, without ceremony, that her daughter had more signal than the reports suggested, and that someone should recheck the study around the L3-L4 region. That evening, Maddie looked up at her mother in the hallway with an expression Elena hadn't seen in over a year, and said, barely above a whisper, the first 2 words she had spoken aloud to another human being in 14 months. "He's different." Elena's throat closed so completely she couldn't answer. She crouched down in front of the wheelchair and simply looked at her daughter's face. Really looked, the way she hadn't let herself in a long time, because looking too closely had started to feel like its own kind of grief. Maddie didn't say anything else that night. She opened her notebook and went back to her patterns, but something had moved, just slightly, just enough. He didn't call it a miracle, he didn't call it anything, he simply moved a piece of foam 2 feet to the left, and said they were going to try one very small thing, and Elena, watching from the hallway through the narrow door window with her arms crossed so tightly her fingers had gone white, did not interrupt, though it cost her everything she had not to. When the session ended, Jonah pushed Maddie's chair to the door himself and told Elena, flatly, that the intake reports might have missed something around the L3-L4 region, and that someone should recheck the nerve conduction study. Elena stared at him. "Have you seen the study?" "No," he said. "I have seen your leg." She had the study pulled the next morning. The specialist who reviewed the new interpretation called Elena at 7:40, a time early enough that she knew before he said a word that something had shifted. There was residual signal in the L3-L4 pathway. Weak, easy to mistake for noise, which was exactly what the original team had labeled it. It might not have been noise. Elena sat down hard on the edge of the hotel bed. "What does that mean practically?" she made herself ask. "It means the pathway isn't dead," the specialist said carefully. "It means there may be more here than anyone realized." She wanted Jonah Reed in a formal meeting with the clinical team by the end of the day. The center director hesitated, the particular hesitation of a professional trying to find a polite way to point out that the man in question mopped the hallways for a living. Elena cut her off before she finished the sentence. "He's the person who found something 11 specialists missed," she said. "I don't care what his badge says." The meeting happened, awkward and crowded, in the director's small office. Jonah arrived last, still in his work polo, and sat in the chair nearest the door, the seat of a man who had spent a long time in rooms where knowing your exit mattered. He listened to the clinical presentation without interrupting, asked 2 questions specific enough that the lead therapist looked at him with something between surprise and recalculation, and then, when asked directly what he would need, answered without hedging. 2 sessions a day. Morning focused purely on the lateral knee signal, very low intensity, very high repetition. Afternoon in the water tank if you have one, because buoyancy takes the fear of falling out of the equation. I want to work alongside your therapist, not instead of her. I'm not licensed, I'm aware of that. "What's your background?" the director asked, not unkindly. "Some conditioning and rehabilitation work," he said. "Military, what branch?" Elena asked. He was quiet for a beat too long. "Navy," he said, and left it there, and something in the careful economy of the answer told Elena there was considerably more behind it than 4 letters. The first 2 weeks produced, by any outside measure, almost nothing. Maddie went through the sessions with resigned compliance rather than engagement, and Jonah did not push, did not perform encouragement, simply ran the same narrow sequence every morning with total unhurried attention, and kept the sessions to 40 minutes, and made no big deal of any of it. On the 15th day, the therapist texted Elena 4 words. "Come in. Now. Please." Elena was in the hallway in under 4 minutes. Through the door window she watched her daughter, sweat at her hairline, staring down at her own right foot, which had just moved an inch forward, unmistakably on purpose. Jonah, crouched 3 feet away, said only, "Do that again," in a voice so calm it was almost a dare. That night, Elena sat on the floor of the hotel room they'd been renting for 2 months, and cried in a way she had not let herself cry since the week of the crash. Not from sorrow, this time, but from something that didn't have a clean name. And Maddie, watching from her bed, reached over without being asked, and put her hand on her mother's shoulder, and that was the first time in 14 months her daughter had touched her first. There were small mysteries, Elena noticed, and did not immediately understand. A folder in the equipment room, tucked under a stack of maintenance logs, with a Navy insignia on the cover that Jonah closed the moment he saw her looking. A phone that buzzed constantly with texts he never answered during sessions, and once, briefly, a name on the screen, Commander Reyes, before he turned the phone face down. A business card that appeared on the front desk one afternoon from a man in an unremarkable gray suit who asked the receptionist, with studied casualness, whether a Jonah Reed still worked there, and left without waiting for an answer when he saw Jonah himself come around the corner. Elena filed each of these away the way she filed away everything that mattered, quietly, without comment, understanding that some doors opened only when the person on the other side decided to open them. Dr. Marsh, the center's director, told Elena over coffee one afternoon that in 8 months she had heard 3 separate families mention Jonah by name as the reason their child had engaged with therapy at all, and that she had also once watched him spot a therapy room camera that had been repositioned without authorization and quietly move it back before anyone else noticed it had shifted. The kind of situational awareness, Marsh said, That you didn't pick up mopping floors. I probably should have asked more questions 8 months ago, Marsh admitted. I didn't, because he was good at his actual job, and I didn't want to lose him over something that wasn't my business. The clinical meetings that followed Maddie's first breakthrough became a weekly fixture. 4 people crowded into Marsh's small office, and Elena watched Jonah in those rooms, the way she watched everyone who mattered to a decision, cataloging not just what he said, but what he chose not to say. He never oversold a result. He corrected Claire once, gently, when she used the word miraculous in a session note, telling her that the word made families stop asking questions, and questions were the only thing that had ever actually helped anyone. Elena, watching, understood she was learning something about honesty that 11 credentialed specialists, for all their honesty about outcomes, had somehow never modeled quite so plainly. The board found out about Jonah Reed the way boards find out about everything, eventually and badly. Richard Calloway, the longest-tenured member of Von Meridian's board, and a man who had been managing risk for longer than Elena had been alive, raised it on a quarterly call with the careful, deniable phrasing of someone who had rehearsed the sentence in advance. There's a perception issue, Richard said, that key clinical decisions around your daughter's care are being driven by input from a facility's employee, and that this is affecting your availability to the company at a critical growth stage. I want to be clear, this isn't personal to the man. It's about the judgment being applied. We've had 11 world-class specialists over 14 months, Elena said, keeping her voice level. In that time, not one of them identified the residual nerve signal that has now been confirmed by a revised study. His name is Jonah Reed, and he found it in 20 minutes. We understand he has some military background, Richard said carefully. 14 years in the Navy, Elena said. I don't know the specifics because he hasn't shared them and I haven't pressed, but the level of expertise it takes to identify and design around a spinal injury profile that stymied board-certified neurologists suggests it's considerably more specialized than his current job title implies. A pause settled over the call, the particular silence of executives recalibrating a position in real time without wanting to say so out loud. I want to be clear about something, Elena continued. The decisions I make about my daughter's care are not board decisions. They are not subject to shareholder input. If there is a perception issue stemming from those decisions, I will manage it personally. What I will not do is remove the one person who has produced a measurable result because the optics are inconvenient to this table. The call ended the way these calls always ended, on professional terms, with nothing resolved and everything understood. Elena sat afterward in the quiet of the rented suite and thought about how easily she herself had once reduced people to the line on their badge, how she had built an entire company on efficient categorization of human capability, and how she had almost let that instinct cost her daughter the one person who had actually seen her. There were harder days before that first breakthrough, and Elena would later think of them as the days she almost failed her daughter twice, once through the crash itself, which had never been her fault, no matter how many nights she lay awake, insisting otherwise, and once through the small, corrosive certainties she had built her whole professional life on, certainties that had almost cost her the one person capable of seeing past them. 6 weeks before Jonah's name meant anything to her, Elena had taken Maddie to a downtown children's hospital for a second opinion consultation with a spinal specialist whose reputation preceded him by several international conferences. The appointment ran long. The hospital was busy. When a nurse wheeled Maddie's chair too close to a supply cart and knocked over a tray of instruments, the floor administrator, a tall man named Gerald Voss, who had clearly had a difficult morning before Elena ever walked in, looked at Maddie in her chair and said, loud enough for the waiting room to hear, that families needed to be more careful with hospital property, as though an 8-year-old with no working legs had steered the cart into the tray herself. Elena had said nothing in the moment beyond a clipped correction of the facts, because making a scene in a hospital where her daughter still needed treatment felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She had absorbed it, the way she had absorbed 100 small humiliations over 14 months, filing them away in the part of her mind reserved for things she would deal with later, when later never quite arrived. Maddie had not said anything either, because Maddie did not say anything to anyone in those months. But Elena had watched her daughter's hands go still in her lap, in a way that told her the words had landed exactly where they were aimed. 3 weeks after that, at a school function Elena had insisted on attending, despite a board meeting scheduled the same afternoon, a well-meaning but careless parent volunteer had organized a relay race for the lower grades without checking whether the course was passable for a wheelchair, and Maddie had sat at the starting line for 4 full minutes while the other children ran past her, laughing, unbothered, entirely unaware that the girl in the chair was doing the math on exactly how invisible she had become to people who meant her no harm at all. Elena had crossed the field in heels, sinking into the grass, and pulled her daughter away from the line before the second heat began, and neither of them spoke about it in the car, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have made it worse. The bank had been its own small cruelty. Elena did not need financing, not really, but the foundation's early rehabilitation grants had required a line of credit against a construction project for an accessible playground near the hospital, and the loan officer, flipping through Elena's file with the particular carelessness of someone who had already decided the answer, had asked twice whether this was really the best use of the foundation's resources, given that most of these children, he said, weren't likely to see much return on the investment. Elena had pulled the financing from a different bank within the hour and made sure the story of why reached exactly the right ears at the first bank's parent company. It had not made Maddie's face any less carefully blank that week. Each humiliation had been small enough to survive and large enough to accumulate, and Elena had begun to understand, somewhere around month 12, that the real damage of that first year had never been only physical. It had been the slow, compounding lesson her daughter was being taught by a world that kept forgetting she was still in the room, that a body that didn't move the way other bodies moved made a person somehow less present, less consulted, less real. 11 specialists had treated the spine. Not one of them had thought to ask what that lesson was doing to the girl inside it. Elena carried her own version of the same lesson, though she would not have named it that way at the time. She had spent a decade building Von Meridian on the premise that value could be read off a resume, that competence announced itself through credentials, that the fastest way to solve a problem was to hire the most decorated person available and trust the decoration. It was, by every measure that mattered to a board of directors, an extremely successful premise. It had also nearly caused her to walk past the one person in 14 months who was actually capable of helping her daughter because he wore a facilities badge instead of a medical one, and because she had been trained, by her own success, to stop looking any further than the badge. Over the following weeks, Elena did what she always did when something mattered. She looked. A cursory background search on Jonah Reed returned almost nothing, which was itself the loudest signal available, because ordinary lives left ordinary digital trails, and the absence of one usually meant a life spent somewhere records didn't reach easily. She learned, in fragments over dinners and hallway conversations, that his wife had died 2 years earlier, fast, the kind of illness that didn't leave room for long goodbyes, and that he had a son, Eli, 9 years old, quiet and sharp-eyed, who sometimes waited in the Ridgeline lobby doing homework when his after-school program ran late. Eli and Maddie met on a rainy Thursday, when Maddie came out of a water therapy session, hair damp, and Eli, without any of the careful avoidance most children performed around her chair, simply asked whether the water was warm or cold. It was the first conversation Maddie had initiated with a stranger in over a year, conducted almost entirely through the notebook she carried, and it ended with the two of them arguing companionably about a shipwreck book Eli was reading, an argument that continued in fragments for weeks. The public reckoning came on a Saturday night at the annual gala for the Vaughn Family Foundation, held in a Denver ballroom Elena had used every year for 6 years running. 400 donors, a program built and rebuilt by a director who understood exactly how much emotional weight a room could carry before it broke. Elena had planned, as she always did, to speak briefly, thank the donors, present the year's grants, and step back into the quiet competence that had carried her through every public appearance since the crash. 3 days before the event, Maddie had slid the notebook across the breakfast table with 4 words written on it. "I want to come." "It's 400 people," Elena said gently. "Cameras, press." Maddie only nodded, and beneath the first line she wrote a second, "Can Eli come too?" Jonah said yes without hesitation when Elena asked, which told her the request wasn't a surprise to him, which told her Maddie had already planned something and simply hadn't told her mother the shape of it yet. Elena understood, with something between pride and terror, that she had just been quietly managed by an 8-year-old, and that there was nothing to do but let it happen. The stage that night had been arranged with a low platform pushed aside and a clear path measured, though no one had said so aloud, at roughly the distance between the podium and the edge of the room. Elena gave her remarks, thanked the donors, and stepped back. And then Maddie's voice came through the handheld microphone the foundation director held at the stage's edge. Small, uneven from 3 years of disuse, but unmistakably a voice, carrying into a room that went, in the space of 2 sentences, entirely silent. "My name is Maddie Vaughn," she said. "3 weeks ago I moved my legs for the first time since I was 6. She spoke for less than 90 seconds. She did not name Jonah directly. She said only that her mother had built the foundation to help kids like her, and that it only worked because of the people her mother found, the ones who showed up and didn't quit. And then she set down the microphone and gripped the chair at the stage's edge and stepped down onto the ballroom floor. Elena, standing at the wing with Jonah beside her, felt his hand close briefly on her arm, not restraining her, just present, and understood in that half-second exactly what was about to happen, and that neither of them had any right to stop it. Maddie crossed the floor. It was not smooth. It took her nearly 90 seconds to cover 20 feet, her arms out for balance, her left knee buckling once at the 10-foot mark so badly the room drew one collective, involuntary breath, and Elena's whole body moved forward before Jonah's grip tightened again. A silent reminder, her choice, and Maddie caught herself and kept going, furious at her own knee in a way that visibly became fuel rather than defeat. She did not walk to her mother. Elena would understand only later, watching the video for the 100th time, what the room had actually witnessed. Maddie crossed the last 6 feet toward the side of the stage where Jonah stood and ran an unsteady, half-falling, entirely unmistakable run directly into his arms, and Elena Vaughn, CEO of a $4 billion company, a woman who had negotiated hostile takeovers without blinking, stood, frozen in place at the edge of that stage, unable to move, unable to speak, watching her daughter choose, in front of 400 people and every camera in the room, exactly who she had been fighting to reach. The room did not applaud right away. It made a different sound first, something rawer and less composed, the sound of 400 people who had come for a fundraiser and gotten something they had no polite category for. Richard Calloway, near the back, was staring at the ceiling in the specific way of a man determined not to cry in a ballroom. Eli, against the wall, said to no one in particular, "I knew she was going to do it." Elena finally moved. She crossed the stage and knelt in front of Jonah and her daughter, and Maddie turned, one hand still gripping Jonah's sleeve, and reached for her mother with the other, and the 3 of them stayed there on the ballroom floor for a long moment, while 400 people remembered, gradually, to breathe. There had been a private breakthrough before the public one, and Elena would not learn about it until 11 days after it happened, because Maddie had asked Jonah directly to keep it from her, and he had agreed, which was, in its own way, the clearest evidence yet of how much her daughter trusted him. It happened on a Friday during the water therapy portion of the afternoon session, the buoyancy tank Claire had insisted on from the beginning because it took the fear of falling out of the equation entirely. Maddie was doing the same sequence she had run dozens of times, eyes closed the way Jonah had taught her, not meditating, just removing one input so she could focus fully on another, directing her attention to the narrow band of signal around her right knee. Then her foot moved, not the small single-inch initiation from weeks before, but a distinct, separate, voluntary flex of the toes, unmistakable to anyone who had spent real time watching bodies for a living. Claire made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Jonah, 4 feet away, said only, "Stay with it, don't open your eyes yet." And when Maddie asked silently with her whole tense face whether she could try again, he said, "Can you do it again?" And, after a long pause, both feet moved this time, right and then left, as if the signal had found a second pathway on its own. Maddie opened her eyes, looked at her feet, looked at Jonah, and reached for her notebook. "Don't tell my mom yet," she wrote. "Why?" he asked. "I want to walk to her when I can," she wrote back. "I want to walk to her." He held her gaze a long moment before agreeing, and he kept his word for 11 days, driving home each evening to make dinner for Eli and sitting afterward at the kitchen table with coffee that went cold while he thought about a girl who wanted to arrive somewhere entirely on her own terms, and how well he understood that particular kind of wanting. The video, 41 seconds captured from a donor's phone at the back of the room, had 4 million views by Sunday morning and 14 million by Sunday night. By Monday it was on every major outlet, most of them unable to identify the man in the frame, the one standing perfectly still at the edge of every shot while a paralyzed girl ran into his arms. Speculation filled the gap the way it always did. He was a hired physical therapist. He was a family friend. One thread, memorably wrong, insisted he was a former professional athlete. Elena's communications director called before 7 Monday morning, the tone of a man who had spent his weekend fielding calls he had no good answers for. "You need to get ahead of this," he said. "If his background comes out through someone else's reporting first, it's a different story than if it comes from you." Elena called Jonah directly, instead of deciding anything without him. His phone, he admitted, had been off since Saturday night, and back on for exactly 40 minutes. "I'm not going to do anything without your permission," she said. "But people are going to find out who you are whether either of us likes it or not." The silence on his end lasted long enough that she heard, faintly, a coffee cup being set down. 14 years, he said finally. Navy. The last 6 of it in a unit whose full name I'm not going to say out loud, doing rehabilitation and resilience work with wounded operators that the official record calls something else entirely. I left because Rachel got sick, and Eli needed somebody standing still. He paused. "I'm not ashamed of any of it. I just never wanted it to be the first thing people knew about me. It won't be the last thing either," she said. "But I'll only put out exactly what you approve, nothing more." The statement that went out Tuesday was 2 paragraphs, spare and accurate, and it did nothing to slow the story down, only to correct its shape. A retired Navy captain, reached by a national outlet, said the only quote that mattered, and the only one that ran everywhere, "I've known Jonah Reed 15 years. If he tells you a child can walk, you'd better clear a path." Commander Reyes arrived at Ridgeline on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the gala, unannounced, in civilian clothes that did nothing to disguise a posture built over decades of formal bearing. Elena was in the hallway when he asked the receptionist, with the same studied casualness the man in the gray suit had used weeks earlier, whether Jonah Reed was in. The receptionist, still not entirely sure why so many people kept asking after the maintenance supervisor, said he was in the East Therapy Room, and pointed the way. Elena followed at a distance, not out of suspicion exactly, more out of the accumulated instinct of 14 months spent protecting every door that led to her daughter. She stood in the hallway and watched through the narrow window as a gray-haired man in his 60s stepped into the therapy room and watched Jonah go very still, the stillness of a man recognizing someone from a life he had deliberately left behind. "Reyes, she is your commander," Elena thought at first, then understood from the way Jonah stood, from the small, automatic straightening of his shoulders, that whatever rank separated them once, something else had grown in its place over 14 years that outranked protocol entirely. She didn't hear all of it. She heard enough. Reyes told Jonah that 2 of the men from his old unit, men who had gone through his rehabilitation protocol after injuries the official record listed only in clinical shorthand, had seen the gala footage and had spent the better part of a week trying to track him down, not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to relief, the particular relief of men who had wondered for years whether the person who taught them how to walk again was doing all right himself. "They wanted you to know they're still walking," Reyes said. "Both of them. One of them just made captain. He wanted you to hear that from someone, not from a headline." Jonah didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he asked quietly how Reyes had found him, and Reyes said the video had done that work for him. The whole world had done that work for him, and there wasn't much point anymore in a man like Jonah Reed staying as invisible as he'd been trying to stay. "I wasn't hiding," Jonah said. "I was just done being the guy the Navy points to when it needs a headline." Reyes looked at him for a long moment with an expression Elena, watching from the hallway, could only half read through the glass. "You built something in that unit that outlived the unit," he said. "I've watched 3 hospitals try to replicate what you did off nothing but secondhand notes and half a protocol document, and none of them get it right. Because none of them understand that the work was never really about the technique. It was about you deciding every single day that a broken body wasn't the end of the conversation." He paused. "You're doing it again. I can see that from the doorway. I just wanted to shake your hand before the rest of the world catches up to what your old team already knew." They shook hands. It was not a dramatic moment, not by the standards of the story that had already made Jonah's name recognizable to strangers. But Elena, watching through the glass, understood she was seeing the last piece of a picture she had been quietly assembling for 8 months. The folder with the Navy insignia, the unanswered texts, the man in the gray suit at the front desk. None of it had ever been a threat. It had all, every piece of it, been evidence of exactly who Jonah Reed already was before anyone in this building thought to ask. She did not mention what she had seen or heard that afternoon. She understood by then the particular respect owed to a man who had spent 14 years learning which parts of himself belonged to the mission and which parts belonged only to him, and she was not going to be the person who took that choice away from him just because she happened to be standing in the right hallway at the right moment. The story did not stay contained to press releases. A journalist at a national outlet, working a different angle entirely, tracked down the retired Navy captain who gave the quote everyone would later repeat, and in the course of that conversation learned something Jonah himself had never volunteered to Elena directly, that the unit he had served the final 6 years with had developed, almost as an internal footnote to its official mission, a rehabilitation methodology for operators wounded in the field so effective that 2 separate military hospitals had quietly adopted pieces of it without ever crediting the source, because the source had never wanted credit, had only wanted the men and women he served with to walk out of a hospital bed under their own power. The journalist called Elena's office to confirm details before publishing. Derek, her communications director, called Jonah first out of respect for the agreement they'd made, and Jonah was quiet on the phone for a long moment before saying only, "Let them print what's already public. I'm not going to lie about who I was. I just never wanted it to be the headline. It became the headline anyway for about a week, and then the headline shifted, the way headlines do, from who is this man to what is he building next. Because by then the Harmon Institute's outreach had already begun. 3 days after the gala, an email addressed to a personal account almost no one had, which told Elena someone had done real work to find him. Within a week, 3 rehabilitation research institutes had reached out. The Harmon Center, the most serious of them, proposed something larger than a single facility, a national program built on exactly the low-intensity, targeted signal approach Jonah had built by instinct and 14 years of hard-won field experience, serving both paralyzed children and wounded veterans on a funding model that didn't depend on what a family could afford. Jonah sat across from the Harmon director, a precise, direct woman named Dr. Adazes Ferris, who had run pediatric neurological research for 2 decades and had very little patience for softened language, for 2 hours before agreeing to anything, and the one condition he refused to negotiate away was this. His compensation would be tied to whether the program actually reached the families who couldn't pay, not as a bonus, but as a floor. If the outcome didn't matter enough to risk his own paycheck on, he said, it didn't matter enough at all. Ferris pushed back once, gently, pointing out that most consultants in his position would be negotiating for more money, not less certainty. Jonah only shrugged. I spent 14 years getting paid the same whether the mission succeeded or not, he said. I got real comfortable with the idea that the work mattering more than the paycheck was the whole point. I'm not going to unlearn that now because somebody's offering me a nicer office. Elena watched him say it and thought, not for the first time, that she had spent 11 years building a career on the opposite premise. That incentive had to be aligned to outcome through contract and metric and quarterly review, and that somewhere along the way she had confused the scaffolding for the actual reason people did good work. Jonah had never needed the scaffolding. He had simply decided a long time ago what mattered and built every decision after that in a straight line back to it. Ferris asked what he would call the methodology for the paperwork, for the eventual publication, and Jonah was quiet for a moment before saying he didn't want his name attached to it. Call it whatever helps it get adopted fastest, he said. It's not really mine. I learned the core of it from a Navy corpsman who served alongside my unit and never got a single line of credit for any of it before he died in the field 11 years ago. If it's going to carry a name, it should carry his. They named the clinical framework after that corpsman, and Jonah kept a small photograph of him at his desk at the Denver Center for as long as the program existed, and told the story to every new hire during training, not as formality, but because he believed, with the same unshakable conviction that had gotten a paralyzed girl walking across a ballroom floor, that credit paid backward mattered as much as progress paid forward. What happens to the kids who don't respond? Jonah asked before signing anything. What's the support structure when the protocol doesn't work? We're building that into the design, Ferris said. Not an afterthought. It usually is an afterthought, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you it won't be here. You'll have to trust me on that. And I understand if you don't yet. Elena's foundation became the funding partner. Claire Osei, the Ridgeline therapist who had run every session at Maddie's side for 6 months, came on to lead the pediatric clinical program. Dr. Marsh, the center's director, joined in an advisory role, and the pilot opened that spring in a converted wing outside Denver with 8 patients, 4 children, and 4 veterans. No ribbon cutting, no press event, exactly the quiet Jonah had insisted on. 12 months after the gala, the program had treated 71 patients across 2 cities. 49 had shown measurable gains beyond what their original prognosis allowed. 14 had returned to activities their intake reports had ruled out entirely. A research paper documenting 3 of the earliest cases had circulated through rehabilitation medicine circles widely enough to begin, slowly, changing textbooks written by people who had never met either Maddie Vaughn or Jonah Reed. Richard Calloway found Jonah at the following year's gala, held deliberately in the same ballroom, because Maddie had insisted the room itself was part of the story and offered an apology 14 months overdue for a comment made on a call Jonah had never been meant to hear about. Jonah accepted it the way he accepted most things, without theater and without needing it repeated. Maddie spoke again that night, 10 years old by then, in low heels her physical therapist had signed off on, and she set aside the 3 pages she'd written and spoke without them, telling the room that the hardest part had never been her legs. It had been 3 years of believing what everyone told her was impossible was simply the truth, and that the man standing at the side of the room had never promised her a miracle, only told her mother there was more signal than anyone had measured, and then shown her how to look for it herself. Eli found out about the scale of his father's new fame the way children usually find out about everything, sideways, through other children, faster and less filtered than any adult conversation could have managed. By the Tuesday after the story broke nationally, Two boys in his class had shown him the gala video on a phone during lunch, and by Thursday his teacher had gently asked whether everything was all right at home, in the careful tone of someone unsure what exactly she was checking on. He came to the center that Thursday afternoon with a particular suppressed agitation Jonah had learned to read in about 30 seconds, and Jonah, instead of addressing it directly, sent him to find Maddie, which had become his standard approach to Eli's specific kind of unsettled energy. Give him something concrete, someone steady to talk to. It's weird, Eli told her in the garden room. People keep talking about my dad like they know him. Maddie wrote something in the notebook. Eli read it. Yeah, but they don't actually know him. They know the video version. I know that's how it works, she wrote back. It's still weird, Eli said. One kid at school told me my dad was famous and I should be proud, and I am proud, but he's also just my dad. He's the guy who burns the grilled cheese every single time and makes me redo my math homework if I rush it. Jonah, who had come partway down the hallway and stopped when he heard the conversation, stood very still outside the door. He doesn't talk about the Navy stuff much, Eli continued, unaware his father could hear him. He told me once that a lot of what happened over there belonged to the people who were actually there, and it wasn't his to hand out to everybody. He looked down at his own hands for a second. My mom told me before she got sick that my dad was the kind of person who carried everyone else's weight so they could keep going. She said it was his best thing and his hardest thing both at once. I didn't really understand that when I was 6. I think I understand it a little better now. Jonah stood in the hallway a long moment, jaw working, before he continued down the corridor and let the two of them keep talking without an audience. By the 2-year mark, the numbers had become the kind of thing Derek put in donor decks, though Elena privately thought no spreadsheet had ever come close to capturing what they meant. The program, now operating out of 3 cities, had treated 138 patients. 83 had shown measurable neurological gains their original prognosis had ruled impossible. 19 veterans had returned to physical activity their discharge paperwork said they would never manage again. The Harman Institute's longitudinal study, published that spring, had been cited in 4 separate revisions of clinical rehabilitation guidelines across 2 countries. A children's hospital in Chicago had opened a program modeled directly on Jonah's protocol, training its own staff through a curriculum he had helped design over 18 exhausting months of flights he never complained about. Because Eli's school was in Denver, and Eli's school was not negotiable. Among the first veterans admitted to the Denver pilot was a former Marine named Thomas Ridley, 38 years old, who had lost the use of his right arm in an explosion overseas and had been told by 2 separate military medical boards that the nerve damage was permanent and the best available outcome was adaptive equipment to compensate for what the arm could no longer do. Ridley arrived at the program skeptical in the particular way of men who had been disappointed by promising-sounding treatments before, and he told Claire during intake that he wasn't there for hope. He was there because his wife had asked him to try one more thing before she stopped asking. Jonah worked with him the same way he worked with everyone, without inflated language, without promises, running a narrow sequence of targeted signal work on a small residual nerve pathway the original assessments had written off as noise. 9 weeks in, Ridley regained a partial grip strong enough to hold a coffee cup without dropping it, a development so small it would not have registered as newsworthy to anyone outside that room, and that Ridley himself described when Elena asked him to speak at the second gala as the day he stopped being furious at his own body. I spent 2 years hating an arm that wasn't listening to me anymore, Ridley told the 400 guests that night, his voice steady in a way it clearly cost him something to hold. Jonah didn't tell me to make peace with it. He told me the nerve pathway wasn't dead, it just needed a reason to remember it was still connected to something. He paused. Turns out that's true about more than nerves. By the 18-month mark, Ridley had regained enough function to return to coaching his son's baseball team, something his discharge paperwork had listed, in the flat clinical language of a closed case, as an activity he should not expect to resume. Gerald Voss, the hospital administrator who had once scolded an 8-year-old for a cart he had positioned too close to her chair, resigned 2 years later amid an unrelated investigation into billing irregularities at his facility, a fact Elena learned from a news alert and did not celebrate so much as simply notice the quiet closing of a loop she had never expected to close at all. The bank loan officer who had questioned the value of an accessible playground sent, 18 months later, an unsolicited donation to the foundation with no note attached, which Elena chose to read as the closest thing to an apology the man was capable of giving, and accepted anyway, because the playground needed the money more than she needed the satisfaction of refusing it. Dr. Marsh retired from Ridgeline the same spring the third program location opened, and she spent part of her last week walking the halls with Elena, talking through everything the pilot had taught her about the limits of her own training. "I ran rehabilitation programs for 20 years, she said, and I built every one of them around the idea that credentials were the ceiling on what a treatment room could produce. I don't believe that anymore, and I'm too old to pretend I'm not a little embarrassed it took a maintenance supervisor to teach me otherwise." She wasn't the only one who said something like that. A senior researcher at the Harmon Institute, reviewing the accumulated case files 18 months in, told a room of clinicians at a national conference that the methodology's most radical feature wasn't a technique at all, it was the decision to keep measuring signal in patients everyone else had already stopped looking at. The room, by all accounts, went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something true and slightly uncomfortable has just been said out loud to people who build their careers on knowing better. The community around the Denver Center grew in ways no one had specifically planned. A local hardware store donated adaptive tools for the program's workshop wing at cost. After the owner's own daughter, a former patient, returned to competitive swimming 18 months after doctors said she wouldn't walk without a brace, let alone swim, a veteran support group began meeting in the center's lobby on Tuesday evenings, unofficially at first, then with Jonah's blessing built directly into the facility's schedule, because he understood, better than most administrators would have, that recovery rarely happened only inside a treatment room. 2 of the earliest pediatric patients returned the following year, not as patients but as junior volunteers, learning to run the same low-intensity signal exercises for newer kids who were exactly as frightened as they themselves had once been, which Jonah considered, privately, the single best outcome the entire program had produced, better than any published paper. Maddie turned 10 that February, then 11 the following year, and the notebook she still carried everywhere filled slowly with fewer of the tight, repeating geometric patterns she had drawn for 3 years after the crash, and more of the loose, uneven sketches of a girl who had stopped needing to control every line on the page. Her cane disappeared before her 10th birthday. Her gait remained uneven, a slight catch in her left step that her physical therapist called a permanent feature rather than a problem to be solved. And Maddie wore it the way you wear an honest scar, without apology, because it was hers, and it was true, and it had been earned. Eli and Maddie's friendship settled into the particular durable shape that childhood friendships take when they are built on something realer than proximity. He taught her, over the course of that first year, an entire private vocabulary of survival facts pulled from his shipwreck books. How to stay calm when things went wrong. How the body follows what you tell it rather than the other way around. Lessons he had absorbed without fully realizing it from a father who rarely spoke about the years that had taught him those same lessons the hard way. Maddie taught him, in return, patience of a kind most 9-year-olds never have to learn, the specific grace of sitting with someone through the slow parts instead of rushing past them. Jonah and Elena did not announce anything, because neither of them had ever been people who announced things. It arrived instead the way real things arrive, gradually through evening phone calls that started as program updates and ran long past the point where program updates were the reason, through a porch on the first warm evening of a Denver spring where Elena finally said out loud that she was tired of protecting herself from something that had already stopped being uncertain, and through Jonah's answer, 3 words, offered without architecture around them, because he had never been a man who needed architecture to mean something completely. I'm not leaving. Richard Calloway found Jonah at the following year's gala, held deliberately in the same ballroom because Maddie had insisted the room itself was part of the story, and offered an apology 14 months overdue for a comment made on a call Jonah had never been meant to hear about. Jonah accepted it the way he accepted most things, without theater and without needing it repeated. "I've had people underestimate me my whole life," Jonah told him. "It's never once stopped me from doing anything." "But that doesn't make it right," Richard said, and Jonah agreed that it didn't, and the two men shook hands and moved on into a room that had, by then, mostly stopped needing convincing. Thomas Ridley was there too that second year, coaching his son's baseball team on weekends now, his right hand steady enough around a bat to demonstrate a swing, and he found Elena near the bar at one point and told her simply that he'd stopped being angry at his own arm sometime around the first spring and had started being grateful instead, which he said was a harder thing to learn than any exercise Jonah had ever run him through. Maddie spoke again that night, 11 years old by then, in low heels her physical therapist had signed off on, and she set aside the 3 pages she'd written and spoke without them, telling the room that the hardest part had never been her legs. It had been years of believing what everyone told her was impossible was simply the truth, and that the man standing at the side of the room had never promised her a miracle, only told her mother there was more signal than anyone had measured, and then shown her how to look for it herself. Elena Vaughn stood at the edge of that stage a second year in a row, and did not freeze this time, because she finally understood what she was watching. Not a rescue, not a miracle bought with money and specialists, though both had played their part. She was watching what happens when someone refuses to accept the conclusion written on a chart, refuses to see a job title as the whole of a person, and simply keeps showing up morning after ordinary morning until the impossible becomes just another Tuesday. After the formal part of the evening wound down, the 4 of them ended up at a corner table, the way they always did now, not by plan, just by the gradual pull of people who have found where they want to be and stopped drifting elsewhere. Eli had a book open, some new shipwreck or another, and Maddie had her notebook, filling a page with the loose, open drawings that had replaced the tight repeating patterns of her silent years. Jonah and Elena sat close enough that their arms touched, talking in the low, easy register of 2 people who had stopped maintaining any real separation between the life they were building together and the work that had brought them to it in the first place. "Richard would like you," Elena said at one point, more to herself than to him. "He told me that, at the start of all this, more or less. He was wrong about the reasons, but he wasn't wrong about the conclusion." Jonah watched Eli and Maddie across the table for a moment. "My wife would have liked you too," he said. "She'd have found you exhausting, in the specific way she found competent people exhausting, because she had high standards, but she'd have liked you." "Is that a compliment?" Elena asked. "It's the highest one I've got," he said. They sat with that not as a weight this time, but as a presence, the acknowledgement of 2 people who had arrived at this table by way of losses that hadn't ended, only stopped being the only thing either of them carried. Maddie looked up at some point, considered the 2 adults across from her and the sleeping boy beside her, and turned the notebook around so they could see what she'd drawn. 4 rough figures at a table, unmistakably them, and underneath 4 words, "This is a family." Jonah looked at it for a long moment, then at Elena, who was already looking back at him. "Yeah," he said, in the same plain, unhurried voice he used for everything that was actually true. "It is." Outside, the first snow of December had started falling, the kind that never sticks in Denver but changes the color of the streetlights for a few hours, makes the ordinary city look briefly unfamiliar. None of them rushed to leave. There was nowhere else that mattered more than exactly where they already were. Maddie, watching the snow through the window, wrote one more line in the notebook before finally closing it for the night. "Can we come back next year?" she asked. And Elena, looking around the room that had held both the hardest and best moments of the last 2 years of her life, said simply, "Yes, the way you say the easiest true thing you know. If you have made it this far, ask yourself honestly what you would have done in Elena's place, how far you would go, how long you would keep showing up for someone the world had already written off." Fatherhood in this story wore a maintenance uniform for 8 months before anyone thought to ask what was underneath it, and it is worth remembering how many people in your own life might be carrying exactly that kind of quiet, unrecognized strength right now. Elena would say, years later, in interviews she gave rarely and only when the foundation's work required it, that the hardest lesson of that first year was not learning to accept her daughter's injury. It was learning to stop mistaking a job title, a badge, a line on a resume, for the whole of a person's worth. She had built a $4 billion company on the efficient sorting of people into categories, and it had taken a man in a facilities polo, kneeling on a therapy room floor with total unhurried attention, to show her that the categories had been lying to her the entire time. The most important people in a crisis are rarely the ones who arrive with the most impressive title attached to their name. They are the ones who actually look, who actually stay, who actually keep showing up on the ordinary, unremarkable Tuesdays when nothing seems to be happening at all. Because that is where the real work quietly gets done, one small, overlooked signal at a time. How far would you go for someone the world had already stopped expecting anything from? What quiet, uncredentialed kindness in your own life deserves a second look? The kind of look Elena almost failed to give, and gave anyway just in time. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes good, steady, unglamorous love is the rarest kind of power there is, and tell us in the comments which single moment stayed with you longest. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the people the world underestimates and the quiet strength they carry anyway, make sure you're subscribed, because there are many more of them still waiting to be told.